Hey, I'm Shyfoxx, and in this tutorial I'll be demonstrating and explaining how I paint hair for my semi-realistic artworks. I'm a full-time freelance artist that's self-taught using things like YouTube tutorials, so hopefully this tutorial can now help you. This particular painting was created as an original character for the fun of hosting a Draw This in Your Style challenge. There'll be more details at the end of the video. You can check out my Instagram. Alright, now let me show you how I do hair. Consider dropping a like in the sub while you're here, as it really helps me create more videos like this one. I'll be explaining as we go how I get my hair to be lineless, as that's key to my semi-realistic art style. I'll be going through the full process of this piece and speed up the not so relevant parts and skip to get to the parts about hair where I can show you and slow it down and explain more. So I begin with a sketch using my usual Loomis method and anatomy knowledge, and then by the time I was ready to sketch the hair here, I knew that I wanted the hair to have a feeling of being flowy and be an important part of the composition. So instead of just having her hair fall down her shoulders and her back, I made it so that her hair was surrounding her and had this sense of movement. It makes the composition interesting and looks great for these semi-realistic, more fantasy type of works, where things like gravity aren't always called into question. We just kind of accept that hair can do its thing. So I'd encourage you guys to think about how you can arrange the hair to make the composition of your piece more interesting. It's important to think about the flow of the hair as a whole, not random pieces in random directions. The hair shouldn't feel random, or, you know, they'll look kind of crazy. But there's a general sense in this piece that the hair is flowing around her, or flowing kind of around her potion that's central to the image, almost like this potion has a magical force pulling her hair around her. So there's a bit of a circular flow and a definite direction for the hair to flow that is appealing in this composition, that makes sense for it and the canvas space I've given myself to work within. Now, as for how I actually sketched it, you'll notice I draw in sections. Hair tends to fall into groups, and this is one of the secrets to successfully drawing hair, whether it's realism, anime hair, or somewhere in between, whether there are lines or not. We want to section and group hair pieces. You can see hair groupings happening in the banks, happening in the longer strands, some of the thinner strands, some thicker. Making your strands overlap each other makes it feel more real and gives more dimension rather than no overlapping happening. You'll notice I do this where I draw the bangs, but I go back and draw more hair pieces over top of the bang area that give a more 3D effect. This becomes more apparent to once colored, and we'll get there. Because drawing hair overlapping each other, like the pieces of hair overlapping each other, can be tricky. To simplify, I would just do kind of one section at a time and erase where the overlaps happen to try and not confuse yourself too much. After sketching her out, I start planning the lighting for the piece. So I add a dark background so I could figure out where the lighting would go. I started with the potion since I want that to glow and be a light source. So from there, I started adding light, lightening up anything and everything that I wanted to stand out against the background, including her hair. So using the lasso tool to outline each section of the hair and then coloring those in with the airbrush to just paint in those sections of hair. I use the airbrush to kind of make it an even coloring job. I then add some base colors over top, and I was going with the idea of pink hair, so I used a color mode type of layer to change the color of the hair without, you know, changing the values, without changing how light or dark the level of the hair currently was. I was just adding the pink hue. At this point, I have my general base colors and lighting done. This is the important step where my painting goes from feeling like a sketch with color to feeling like it's a lineless painting. What I do here is dim the opacity of the sketch layer, which is a layer that is sitting on top of the color and lighting layers. It's the top most layer. So I turn down the opacity of it, not all the way, but I do fade it out to give room for rendering some details without losing my guidelines. As I paint, I do fade the sketch out more and more, the less and less I need it. Some parts of the sketch remain more visible than others. For example, I tend to keep a lot more of the lines around the face details, and with the hair, I typically get a lot of those sketch lines by the time I get far enough along to need them. So what I've explained right here is really the answer to lineless artwork, and it's important for achieving a semi-realistic art style, and I'm going to get into more of how the sketch ultimately goes away through blending, so just hang on. I section up areas of the painting for rendering by lassoing parts and having them on their own layer. I do this for the hair, face, body, skin, and the potion. I do this by making a merged version of the faded sketch plus the color merged together, and copy the lassoed areas onto their own layers of each part. Hopefully you followed me there, but On the screen, you'll kind of be able to see how I have each layer of, being a section of what I described, whether that's the hair or the face or the body. So the hair then ends up being on its own layer, color and faded sketch merged as you see it here. Now the way I do hair for this one, because it was a more complex hairstyle with groups that may overlap, I decided to divide sections of the hair further, divide further up on separate layers. So the bang separate from the flowing hair, that's separate from the potion side of the hair, for example. This just makes my rendering phase cleaner and quicker. So again, the lasso tool comes out and selects the hair that I want to section for a layer. Once I selected everything I want for the layer, it's just a matter of copy pasting to a folder that I named hair and then doing all the sections. I ended up with 4 layers dedicated to various sections of the hair. Now, if I've confused you talking about layers, don't worry too much about this part, but this is just me trying to explain why I use different layers, and it's really just for the efficiency of rendering quicker. Just a small note, I often get asked what I mean by rendering. So when I say rendering, it's this part, the part where you add shadows, add highlights and details and color. It's kind of a fancy way of saying coloring, but it's more than just coloring since we're taking into account all of the lighting, shadows, details in addition to color. So one of the very first things I do to render is blend my sketch into my painting on each of the layers we lassoed to be separate. I take a blending brush, not a blur brush, but a blend brush that nicely merges our sketch into the colors of the layer it's on. So you can see me going around the sections of hair, blending the sketch in, and ultimately making our sketch kind of disappear. And I don't blend the same everywhere. Sometimes some things are blended more and some areas blended less. It depends on how much line definition that I want from one section to the next, or from one area of hair overlap in this case with another area. Once things are all blended in the way that I like, not aiming for perfection by the way, we want to not waste time. So after having done a decent job of blending areas of the hair, making that sketch sort of blend in and making it more lineless, I start adding in areas of shadow and highlight. Shading areas that would be in shadow and adding highlights where the hair would have more shine. A lot of my shadows that I put in actually mimic original sketch lines that we had, so they can kind of get shaded back in, but it's done with a brush tool instead of just one of those with the lines from the sketch from before. I tend to shade hair with a combination of the airbrush tool, brush tool, and water brush tool. The airbrush tool is good for gradients of light and dark. I use it, large brush size, so I can apply it to general overall areas of where I want light and dark to be with the hair. That's kind of the first thing I do. So the airbrush really helps me get that general sense of overall lighting. The brush tool helps me add details of shadows and highlight, and the watercolor brush tool, which is a default brush of Clip Studio Paint, by the way, is a brush I like to use for hair texture because it actually has a bit of that like hair-like brush texture to it. And rendering hair, like rendering any area, is a matter of building up paint, building up shadows, building up highlights and all the details. So you'll see I go back in and add more shadows, go back in, add more highlights, go back around the image and go back many times before I get it to a place where I'm happy. I'm usually thinking about lighting being key for deciding how much more shadow I need and how much more highlight I need, looking at a piece as a whole. If it's looking flat, then we probably need more shadows and highlights, more lighting contrast. I made a whole video dedicated to knowing how dark your shadows should be and how light your highlights should be, so really just talking about values. So if you'd want to see that video, learn more about this, then I'll put that in the top right so you can click on that and see. So we slowly build up our shadows, lighting, and details, aka we render continually until we complete sections, or complete them enough that we want to do another section. I find it's best not to draw a whole section in one go and then do another, for example, like fully rendering the face to completion and then doing the hair and then doing the body. It doesn't create for as a cohesive piece, whereas if you kind of bounce around the image, adjusting as you go, using other parts of the image to make decisions for the new areas you're working on, it just really helps create a cohesive piece in the end. So as you're painting, you can kind of bounce around the piece and build areas up as you go. As we bounce back to rendering the hair, you can see I add more shadows and more strokes for highlights. You'll notice I turn layers on and off, which I don't always do, but with this project, as the hair was complex and overlapping on different layers, it helped me to see which hair sections I was working on at the time, so I would turn those layers on and off as I needed them individually. Ultimately, if the layers and sectioning thing is confusing to you, you can literally just have all your hair on one layer. Many artists paint this way too, and it's not better or worse to do it this way, but it's just what works for each individual artist, and more layers helps me paint faster and more exact for my art style. After rendering the face some more, I go back to the hair and intensify some of the shadowed and highlighted areas, as well as just cleaning up areas that look messy. I then start adding in individual strands of hair. This is an important step that usually is towards the end of rendering the hair. These strands are placed around her hair to give it a sense of realism. Often there is usually a strand or two of hair that are out of place from the groupings of hair nearby. Now, I want to emphasize that hair strands should not just be randomly placed around. That's kind of a misconception when you see these kinds of artworks, is that hair pieces are just kind of like random. They need to be mindfully placed, as a strand that goes the wrong way could look odd and can actually be a bit of a make or break for it looking good. Typically, hair strands follow the same flow of hair, but not exact, since the strands are ultimately doing their own thing, but generally follow the same flow of hair direction, so that's kind of important. The majority of strands of hair that you draw in should be positioned at the edges of the hair grouping rather than in the middle of the hair sections, if you can follow what I mean. So where the hair meets the background is a good place for stray hairs. You can see me adding them there. I added some extra strand pieces at the tips of the hair as well, so you can just go back in and make it feel more hair-like, essentially, by adding stray hairs into these sections and split into strands at the ends. And be careful not to overdo this part. There's definitely such a thing as too many stray hair strands. You'll notice I start bringing in some blue into the hair. I was experimenting a bit to see what it might look appealing to take this hair to the next level, and we can do that with varying colors and playing with colors. So in areas of more shadow, I added the blue, and then areas that were brighter, I added warmer pink color. This creates a larger range of hue and makes it feel more realistic, as our shadows can have that extra like coolness to them, and our highlights can have that warmth. This is a great trick that can be applied throughout the whole piece, having cool colors added to all of our shadows and warm colors to all of our highlights. This is kind of like a color theory thing, so good to note. Ultimately, adding in other colors to the hair should be determined based on your environment the character's in. Also, when it comes to color, have fun and experiment. You never know what happy accident you might create. I often keep many of the things in my art when I do this. I actually hadn't decided what she should be wearing for quite some time, as it to me was a bit of an afterthought. I cared about her face, her hair, and the potion, and ultimately leaving everything else, including the background, to be of a secondary importance and have a lot less time put into them. Some final touches for the hair get added as I once again increase the depth of my shadows, adding more darkness using a dark purple and adding some more highlight using a light pink. Some adjustments are made as I see they are needed based on the artwork as a whole, some background details until I feel the rendering is done. And as a final step, I play with things to color correct, value adjust, and make the art more appealing, kind of like adding filters that you do on social media with your photos. So you can think of it like that. You can find these under the filter layer correction options. And here it is all done. Once again, if you want to join my Draw This in Your Style of this artwork, I'm hosting that over on Instagram. I'll have a link in the description to that so you can join us. And ultimately, if you still want to draw her and the challenge is over, you definitely can. You can draw her, you can still use the hashtag and everything. You just wouldn't be eligible for the prizes and stuff, so just note that, but you can still draw her. I'd love to see what you guys come up with. I hope this video was helpful. A similar video of mine, if you like this one, for learning my process of painting, would be my semi-realistic anime style tutorial, so you can check that out. But I hope you learned something in this video, and if you did, maybe like and subscribe if you haven't, and comments are also really appreciated. So good luck with your art journeys, and I'll see you next time. Bye!